The theater was full of chatter, and amidst the audience a sort of restless energy was incubating within the seats. This was the first time I had ever been to an opera. And sure, though my mother had countless amounts of CDs of Andrea Botticelli, and I was a regular, enthusiastic member of my violin class, I'd never been to a real opera. This particular one was called Carmen by Georges Bizet. Suddenly, the lights began to dim, the chatter melted into murmur, and quiet began to fill the darkness. We were strangers entering the realm of the theater's imagination. As the curtains unfolded, I was completely submerged in the passion and drama, so invested in the lives of characters I had never met. And along with the music, it was as if a little piece of me was being taken and transformed, so that when I came back home, I was a little different. In my 9-year-old eyes, I had felt the anger, the joy, and the pain of the characters so deeply, they felt very much alive. How many of you have felt something like this before? Going to the theaters with that smell of popcorn, reading a book, listening to a podcast as you jog down the road and say hi to the neighbors, or watching the end of Infinity War and wondering what it was all really for. Now this is the point where all of you raise up your hands and I say, that's what I thought, but currently 2020 has had other plans and my only audience member today is my mother. So thank you, Mama. Now I am yet to meet another 16-year-old who is as passionate about opera as I am. But if there is something in common between all of us, it's that you and I love a good story. Stories, especially in the form of theater, have been a passion of mine since a very young age. We all know and have lived through the thrill of play pretend in our early childhood years. You know, being able to create stories and experiment with the social and emotional roles in life. I was already a master at play pretend. My mom had this trunk of dress-up clothes with, old shoes, sparkly tiaras. You could name it all. It was in that trunk. My personal favorite game was called forcing your cousin and sister to turn into flies so that Isabel the butterfly could come and save them from the kitchen spatula. We would play for days on end, but to me, they were not just games, they were stories. To all of us they were, because in that special time of play pretend, we were discovering the power of language and how we as humans interact with each other. Already at this age, we had a dire need to create and learn from our stories. One could say that the opera Carmen had become a sort of creative awakening for me. I somehow became dangerously obsessed with theater. So when I finally got up on that stage, it was no wonder that I just fell in love with it. I remember the first ever school play I ever auditioned for was The Lion King. Now, all my friends wanted to be Simba and Nala, and sure, that was cool, but I wanted to be Scar, the evil uncle who dismantles a whole peaceful kingdom in order to establish a dictatorship ruled by oppression and fear, all whilst plunging his very own brother to his death. Seems like an odd choice for somebody who still slept with the nightlight. But regardless, this experience left me intrigued. So I became unstoppable. Did everything from Alice in Wonderland, Pride and Prejudice, The Coward, Les Mis, Mamma Mia. Acting and theater, I find, are special in the ways that they celebrate life. They vividly depict what it means to be alive. The anger, joy, pain, heartache, these are the very ingredients that make up stories. And stories, at the end of the day, are meant to reflect our humanity. Now, I don't think there is a proper way to describe what I feel on stage when you completely lose yourself. And like a messenger, you allow yourself to fade away so that the other voice can speak. It wasn't until I auditioned for the role of Linda in Death of a Salesman, however, that I began to question the importance of theater and how it gravely affects people. For those of you that don't know, Death of a Salesman is a play written by Arthur Miller meant to address the loss of identity in its main character, Willie Loman, and his inability to accept change that lead him to develop dangerously suicidal thoughts and frustrating encounters with his two sons, who have ultimately failed him in life. When I first began, I wasn't really sure why I was there. It was a depressing play with depressing characters and a hopelessly depressing storyline. I didn't have time for that, right? When I got my character, I was confused. Linda was dealing with some very dark themes in her life. As a pillar of the family, she had to remain in control, loving her husband, even though the very seams of his mind were falling apart. I'm not gonna lie, it was scary. How could I tell the story of a family so dysfunctional and torn? And more importantly, why? What about this story made it worth telling? And that is my question to you. Why are we obsessed, consumed by telling and listening to stories when we could be productive in other ways? I, for one, spend 12 to 16 hours a week rehearsing in the theater or more. But that is nothing. To put things into perspective, according to the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the average Canadian spends 27 hours per week watching television. That's a whole day. And with this pandemic, I would be positive that these numbers have increased. Outer Banks and Riverdale, I'm looking at you. But film and stories are not just something of the modern age. They are vividly integrated into our societies, from the beats of the early Neanderthalic music to the first plays ever performed in the theater of Dionysus, all the way to the Romantic era, when the opera Carmen was first composed. Storytelling has become the most important we as humans possess. We have a need to use it to put meaning to people, to faces, to color, to sound. Many of you might say it is a form to escape our dreary lives because they can be so miserable. We go to the theater, we watch the play, we come back to our houses and resume our daily struggles. To quote one of my brilliant math teachers, sometimes I just want to escape my obligations, grab my lightsaber, and dance across my living room to the Imperial March. And yes, though this may be true, we do not completely escape when we are subjected to a narrative. In fact, Jonathan Gottschall, fellow TED Talker and author of The Storytelling Animal, did a series of experiments observing the brain whilst watching a movie. Through these experiments, he was able to see that the brain was actually mimicking the emotions on screen. So when the actor was scared, the viewer was also scared. So when I saw my first opera, I had actually been experiencing the same sort of phenomenon. Furthermore, these authentic simulations of human experience can be so powerful, they can change our behaviors and attitudes, something called the Will and Grace effect. And frankly, thank goodness for Jonathan Gottschall, because I have no idea where this TED Talk would be going without him, so thank you, sir. So when we experience a narrative, tons of chemicals are being released in our brains, such as dopamine during cliffhangers, oxytocin when we empathize with characters, endorphins when we laugh, but also adrenaline and cortisol, which make us irritative and critical. But on a more emotional and personal level, stories keep things alive. People say that the past is gone, no longer existing, but it is through stories that we honor the dead, really. The blood that used to pump through their veins, that they filled them with life, the waves of electric impulses that used to control a pulsing heart. All of these are replaced with memory. Memory is composed of all the tiny stories reminiscent of a person, like the cells that make up a human entity. Stories are a reflection of ourselves, of our people, and we must therefore identify with them. So here was my answer. Why should I perform in Death of a Salesman? Story is the connective tissue of society. It is inescapable. It arrived to us when our parents first began to read to us, and then we took over and began to create our own through play pretend. Yeah, that's me. Now, for those of you that say that multitasking is not a thing, I beg to differ. I mean, look at that. Here I am sporting a super cute tracksuit, reading a book, eating a cookie. I don't even know what that is. It's like a cookie, and ... you can fill in the rest. But we really do live inside a blizzard of stories. And as actors, we are sunbathing in stories. Putting on a play as demanding as Death of a Salesman was no easy task. I mean, who would have thought that a bunch of crazy, hormonal teenagers could pull off one of the most iconic plays in American theater? I remember during dress rehearsal, every possible disaster came in to tear apart the ligaments of our hard work. Lines were forgotten, there were costume malfunctions, there were several missed cue calls of which I am guilty of. I fell off the stage, and one of our crew members even had an anaphylactic shock to Reese's Pieces, for goodness sakes. It felt almost impossible that we should be able to pull this thing off. And might I remind you, this was still 2019, so we were saved from the wrath of 2020. But we held on to each other, like artists gripping on to the last ashes of a burned canvas, artists blindly believing in their crafts, that a bunch of high school students could really do this, could really deliver this message and move people. And on opening night, it really felt like we did. I was once told that the bond in theater kids is one of the strongest ones of the school. Dropping into the reality of the scene in relationship with your fellow cast members, sharing these profound, transcending moments with each other, and selflessly exposing your vulnerability to the audience. Not trying to be sappy or cheesy or anything, but I find that when young people come together to perform theater, it gives us a place to explore the many voices of humanity, and through that, it gives us a place to belong. Because I chose to perform in Death of a Salesman, I was moved profoundly when after the show, when the curtains had fallen, I had undressed from my vintage shoes and dressed back into my sweatpants. People came up to me, sharing the tears I had cried on stage, and told me that this production had moved them, that it had changed them, that the Linda they saw up on stage was the very representation of who their mother was, who their sister was, and I had to live it to finally understand. There is nothing more rawly human than telling a story. People went home that night with a connection, feeling less alone in their own suffering because somebody had written a story about them as the audience. Not escaping reality, but understanding it. Thank you.